What's up guys, it's Jesse here and welcome back to the channel. There's a lot of buzz at the moment about inflation and interest rates, but it can be a bit of a brain teaser. So I wanted to unpack it as we constantly hear these two topics spoken about daily and how they relate to each other. So what is inflation? Inflation is an increase in the level of prices for goods and services that a household buy, such as petrol, groceries, etc. Currently, inflation is sitting at 7% in Australia. But what does that actually mean? If inflation is at 7%, it implies that on average, you would need 7% more money to buy the same basket of goods and services that you could have purchased for a lower amount before the inflation period. In other words, the value of your money has decreased and you can buy fewer goods and services with the same amount of money that you could have previously. Now, this 7% inflation number has the RBA or Reserve Bank of Australia losing their minds. And the only tool the RBA have against inflation is to raise interest rates. Raising interest rates is done to make borrowing money more expensive. When borrowing is pricier, people and businesses tend to spend less on things like homes, cars, investments. This reduction in spending helps slow down the economy and can lower the demand for goods and services. As a result, this can bring down inflation because when there's less demand for things, their prices don't rise as quickly. But in layman's terms, the purpose for the RBA raising interest rates is so you have less money to spend, which doesn't feel great, right? Now, the RBA have come under some serious criticism lately because they have been taking a sledgehammer, metaphorically, to the everyday Australian, especially the former governor of the RBA, a bloke by the name of Philip Lowe. This guy famously said in early 2022 that interest rates would not increase until 2024. And since that statement, interest rates have increased 12 times.
The condition for a rise in the cash rate will not be met until 2024. I'm certainly sorry if people listened to what we'd said and then acted on that. I'm just one individual here and we've got 9 people taking these decisions.
Now, many people took this statement as gospel and went out and borrowed large sums of money to buy property and investments. And I mean, why wouldn't you? Now, I understand that we don't live in a fairy tale of cheap interest rates and that interest rates couldn't stay at 2% forever. But when the person in charge of setting those interest rates says that he's not going to increase them for 2 years, it's only natural that you're going to believe him. Now, let's put those interest rate rises into some perspective. In May 2022, you could get a variable home loan rate for just 1.9%. And now Australians are paying between 5.5% to 6% on their variable rates. And what really gets me going is that if inflation is just 7%, it means that the average cost of purchasing something has increased 7%. But interest rates going from 2% to 6%, well, that's a 200% increase. This is crazy. For further context, if you had a $1 million mortgage 18 months ago at a 2% home loan rate, then it would cost you about $20,000 a year in interest repayments, or just $1,666 per month. Now, that same $1 million home loan at the current average variable rate of 6% costs $60,000 a year in interest, or $5,000 per month. And this has seriously affected some people's borrowing capacity. For example, in April of 2022, if you had an approval for a $500,000 home loan based on your income, your borrowing capacity has been absolutely slashed by almost 40%. That means if you qualified for a mortgage of $500,000 based on that same income, you would now only qualify for a $300,000 mortgage, which is wild. And it gets even crazier when you go to the top end of town. So back in April of 2022, before interest rates started rising, if you could afford to service a $4 million home loan based on your income, you would now only qualify for a $2.4 million mortgage. That's a drop of $1.6 million in your purchase price, which is insane. Now, as I mentioned, and as you would expect, this Philip Lowe character wasn't too popular after his statements about interest rates not increasing and then subsequently increasing 12 times. When brought before the Australian Parliament to explain why he made the comment about not raising interest rates and then raising them To be honest, he didn't have the greatest answer. And when asked if he would apologize, he did not. He was then asked if he believed he should keep his job, to which he responded, yes, it's a 7-year appointment. Not the best PR move after you just raised interest rates 12 times in a row after you said there wouldn't. It was brought to the Australian public's attention that this individual was actually receiving a combined salary of $1,037,709 per year. Safe to say that too was not very well received by the Australian public, and only a month later, after Philip Lowe's statements, he was sacked as the governor of the RBA. He has since been replaced by a woman named Michelle Bullock, and since then the RBA have left interest rates on hold for the last 2 months, which is fantastic and a very well received relief for every Australian family out there with a home loan. There are claims that the current rise in inflation has been driven by wage growth. However, research conducted by the Australian Institute reveals that most Australians believe and understand that the current rise in inflation has not been driven by wage growth, contrary to what the Reserve Bank have said. The Australian Institute also surveyed Australians about their views on the cause of inflation as well as their solutions, with respondents identifying corporate profits as the major factor, while also backing a broader response from governments. The key findings of the report was that 34% of Australians believe that the biggest cause of inflation was companies increasing their prices by more than their cost, more than any other cause in fact. And this is backed by a news article by news.com, which found that Qantas had a profit of $1.4 billion. That's a lot, right? While supermarket giant Woolworths revealed a $907 million profit, up by 14% on the previous year, and fellow grocery juggernaut Coles saw a $643 million profit, which grew by 17.1% from the previous year. But that's not the biggest windfall. CBA, or the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, have just announced a record $10.16 billion profit. Now, this isn't a dig at CBA or the food chains. This is just a fact which highlights what many Australians believe is that the current inflation is profit driven and not normal inflation, which is supply and demand. Simply that things cost more and the supplier is passing on those costs. It doesn't feel as though that's the case here. Now, the research conducted by the Australian Institute also revealed that Australian wages were not the culprit, with only 5% of respondents to the survey believing that rising wages are the biggest reason for inflation. And this is consistent with reality, that Australian wages have fallen behind the prices since the start of the post-pandemic inflation, falling 6% in real terms in the last 2 years. The research also found that 1 in 3 Australians think that putting price caps on essential goods and services would be the most effective way to combat inflation in Australia. And just under 1/3, 28% to be exact, chose that taxing back excess profits from corporations and using the proceeds to reduce prices would be the best response to inflation. Chief economist at the Australian Institute Centre for Future Work, Greg Jericho, said that Australians are far more aware than the Reserve Bank that inflation has been caused by companies increasing prices by more than their cost. And he went on to say, these survey results provided a timely notice to the government and the newly appointed governor of the Reserve Bank, Michelle Bullock, that almost most Australians believe that there are better ways to tackle inflation rather than just dramatically lifting interest rates. And to me, that actually makes complete sense, especially when you consider that the fact inflation affects 100% of the population, right? However, interest rates only affect people who have a mortgage, which is less than you might think. According to the 2021 census, which is the most recent Australia-wide survey, only 35% of Australians actually have a mortgage, while 31% are owned outright and the other 30% are rented. So it makes sense that Australians aren't happy with combating inflation simply by raising interest rates. Instead, the government should look to the private sector where companies are taking advantage of the situation and making huge profits. Or look at ways to minimise inflation which every Australian can contribute to, rather than only those with a mortgage. Well, thanks for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe and stay tuned for next week's episode.